This is your Irish Diary, presenting the romance and reality of Irish life then and now. Auric Éireann, or Irish Diary, is presented by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation of St. Paul. Professor John McKiernan of the College of St. Thomas in St. Paul is writer and narrator.
This is the ship that launched an attack from America upon Australia, one of the strangest stories in the relations between Ireland and America. The story of Irish democracy is very interestingly related to the story of American democracy. Both were born at the end of the 18th century, and there were certain similarities in their birth. Modern Irish democracy was born at a meeting in Belfast, in Northern Ireland, of course, and it was spurred and developed chiefly by the Irish Presbyterians. It's a fascinating story, this story of the birth of Irish democracy, and it came as a result of parliamentary laxity, shall we say, similar to the parliamentary laxity that brought about the resentfulness of the colonists and gave us the American Revolution. You know Jonathan Swift, of course, and earlier in the 18th century, he had added his fuel to this fire when he suggested that the Irish might burn everything that came from England except her coal. Well, during the 18th century then, the relationships between England and Ireland became increasingly subject to change, and the change was that the Parliament in Dublin, which of course was a Protestant parliament and a parliament from which Catholics were barred completely, but nonetheless a parliament that became more and more resentful of the successful attempts of the English to destroy Irish trade and indeed virtually all cultural and economic growth in the country. Now, this 18th century development of resentfulness on the part of an Irish parliament which did not represent the entire country, but which was the only parliament there was in the country, this growth of resentfulness on the part of that parliament was so successful by the end of the 18th century, roughly about the time of the American Revolution and a few years afterwards, so successful that in 1783, this parliament was able to persuade the parliament in London to pass what is called the Act of Renunciation. In 1783, this was passed. And according to the terms of the Act of Renunciation, England forswore forevermore any claims upon Ireland. This meant that the Irish had a great deal more freedom to do what they felt best for their own country economically, and this they proceeded to do, and were so successful that these last few years of the 18th century represent a great high point in the commerce and industry, and indeed in the arts of Ireland. However, although the Irish Parliament, I don't have time to tell that whole story, was successful in persuading England, and perhaps I should say one of the great forces of persuasion was the fact that there was at that time a large body of men under arms in Ireland, and these were called the Irish Volunteers. Despite the fact that England had passed this, or I should say because she had passed it, the fears in England with regard to Ireland were aroused to a new height. And every attempt was made now to suborn the Irish Parliament and to coerce it And indeed, this was done in this fashion. The Under-Secretary Cook told the Prime Minister Pitt that only by uniting the two countries, bringing them together in one parliament, could Ireland be kept from becoming, and I'm using his words, too great and too powerful. So that the Act of Union was passed in 1800, only 17 years after England had sworn forevermore to remove herself from Irish affairs. This was passed by the Irish Parliament, but a Parliament that had been bought and undermined completely by the English influence. This now brings to a focus two aspects of thought or of political development in Ireland. One, a parliamentary, and one, a physical force or revolutionary one. The Irish Parliament, by peaceful means, although possibly with the thought of those armed Irish volunteers in the background, but by peaceful means had persuaded England to withdraw from Irish affairs. And yet, long before 1800, it was seen that the Irish Parliament was being bought over by English. The English expenditure for this purpose amounted to something like the creation of about 26 peerages and the spending of about £1.25 million sterling. But it was seen before the end of the century that this is what was to happen. And therefore, before the end of the century, we had a revolutionary outbreak in Ireland. And from then on, we might say from the end of that 18th century when modern democracy was born in Ireland, from then on through the 19th century, we had always two streams of political thought, one the peaceful or the parliamentary, and one the revolutionary. So that we opened then the 19th century with a parliamentary union, which Lord Byron, you remember the British poet, called the union of the shark with its prey. We opened that with a parliamentary union and with a revolution directed against it. 1798, of course, came just before the Union, but Robert Emmet's revolution came just after it. And then we go down through this century, and we have the O'Connell movement, which is a parliamentary movement, and we have that paralleled by the 1848 revolutionary movement. We come later into the century, and we have a Parnell movement, and we have a Fenian movement, roughly at the same time. And then we come into the 20th century, and we have the Redmond parliamentary movement, and then we have the 1916 revolutionary movement. So we might say that the end of the 18th century is marked by this development in Irish politics of a dual track, a peaceful means and a violent means for asserting Irish national aspirations. Why do I bring that up today? And what connection has it with that ship? That ship was the result of one of the revolutionary movements. I mentioned to you that in the 19th century we had a revolutionary movement, the Fenians, and a peaceful movement, Parnell. I'd like to say something about the Fenians for a few moments, because that ship was a Fenian venture, a Fenian attack upon Australia. If you want to call it an attack, it was certainly an act of violence against the sovereignty of Australia, or such sovereignty as we might say Australia had, being a member of the British Empire. So we might say it's an attack upon the sovereignty of the Crown. Well, on with our story of the Fenians. After the 1848 revolution failed in Ireland, many of the leaders were transported. Some of them fled, some of them came to America. And shortly after their arrival in America, they founded a revolutionary organization. And when in Ireland, the revolutionary organization known as the IRB, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, when that was established in Ireland, the American one affiliated with it. So that on both sides of the Atlantic now, we had an Irish revolutionary organization established for one purpose: to bring about a violent overthrow of the English power in Ireland and to establish a democratic republic. This was the oath that they took, and this was the oath that was established in Belfast by the Presbyterian organizers of the revolutionary organization at the end of the 18th century. So we see the end of the 18th century, Belfast Presbyterians establishing a revolutionary movement which in the 19th century still continues, greatly under Protestant leadership, but not completely. The Irish and the American revolutionary organizations took advantage of the Civil War. The American Civil War was a godsend. There were thousands of Irish who fought on the Union side and on the Confederate side. And while most of them enlisted simply because they were fighting for their adopted country, many of them enlisted for military experience or began to think, when the war was on, that wouldn't this experience be very helpful to Ireland? So that after the war, we had a rather significant body of Irish Americans who had been trained, who had gone through a very severe testing, a great military adventure, and wanted to do something to free Ireland, to put this knowledge to use. There was a bit of hesitancy in Ireland about the date of the rebellion, and there was a great deal of pushing from America. At any rate, to shorten this story, in April 1867, a ship called the Jacmel left American shores, ostensibly bound for Cuba, and carrying a cargo, apparently, of pianos and sewing machines and other heavy items. But actually, of course, it would carry 200,000 rounds of ammunition, 8,000 rifles, several pieces of artillery, and 40 Irish-American officers commanded, most of whom had seen who had learned their trade of war in the Civil War. They sailed for Ireland, first taking a route in the direction of Cuba, and then, after a day or so, sailing directly for Ireland. A few days before they arrived, they rechristened the ship Erin's Hope. They ran up the green flag and cheered and continued their voyage, but they were eventually, although they eluded several British warships, they were eventually picked up. Meantime, there had been a rising in Ireland, but this had failed. Now that apparently was the story of the Fenians and the Irish Americans, except for that ship which you saw at the beginning of this program. The rising failed, and many of the prisoners were shipped to a penal colony in Australia. You know the story of the founding of Australia and Van Diemen's Land and so on. These were used as penal colonies by England for a long time. So that many of the Irish prisoners were sent down there and under heavy guard, kept there to serve very long sentences. One of those prisoners got a message back to America. So here is one of these prisoners by the name of Wilson, sends a messenger back to another exiled Fenian who is in America. That man in America, John Devoy, one of the great Fenian names in the history of Fenianism, of course, one of these great names, he read this appeal for rescue an appeal from Fenian prisoners in Australia begging, can you come to our rescue? And to Devoy, it seemed like a hopeless task. Where was he to get the money? And indeed, even if the money were provided, there were certainly greater obstacles. How could this be organized so as not to have the secret leak out to England? Well, the extraordinary thing is this, that money was collected from Irish exiles in Australia, in New Zealand, in England, and in America, and other places in Ireland too. Well, there was a need for a ship. What sort of ship? A ship was found, the ship the Catalpa. It was found and captained by Captain George S. Anthony, to whose name, perhaps, a statue should be erected someday. This was Captain George Anthony, recently married, with a baby daughter of a few months at home. He was now a landlubber, hungry for the sea. He was pining away, in other words, at a desk. And his father-in-law, who was acquainted with the Irish revolutionaries in this country, suggested that this was the man for the job. Captain Anthony agreed that he would undertake it. It seemed like a wild venture, but he was interested in anything that smacked of freedom. He had that 19th century American zeal for the oppressed. A ship was found then, the Catalpa, a fairly small vessel, 200 tons, about 90 feet long. It was a whaling ship. And the crew that was selected thought it was going on a whaling cruise. They were ordered to go whaling for 6 months and to ship back whale oil to America. This sounds much like Moby Dick, you know. To ship back their whale oil to America and then to proceed into the southern seas and make their way to Australia, and further orders would be given to them there. It becomes now an international espionage sort of thing. This whole thing, remember, remarkable, isn't it? The money collected in secrecy, the whole venture mounted in secrecy, and months at sea, and still not a word gets out to the British Secret Service or to American authorities or to anyone else. At any rate, one of the ironical experiences enjoyed during this cruise was the meeting by Captain Anthony and his vessel, the Catalpa, the meeting of a ship by the name of the Ocean Beauty. And if you have recently come from your Moby Dick, you may recall these meetings that passing ships have in the middle of the sea, called gams. So there was such a gam between the two vessels, and Captain Anthony visited the Ocean Beauty and discovered that the captain was the same captain who had commanded the ship, the British prison vessel, that had carried the Fenian prisoners to Australia. When he discovered this, he wondered whether the captain might possibly have the coastal charts of Australia, at least that section of it around Fremantle, where the prisoners were, and Bunbury, and the captain had them. The most extraordinary thing, Captain Anthony was able to cajole the captain into giving him the very charts that Anthony needed in order to locate safe harborage for the rescue of his prisoners. Well, quite a number of weeks further were invested, and ultimately, almost a year after their original sailing from America, they came to the Australian coast, and now they were to await their further orders. In the meantime, a genius was at work in Australia. His name was Breslin. This particular man, who planned the whole Australian the manipulation of the rescue team. He had gone to Australia posing as a capitalist, if you will, a man with lots of money to invest. And in that pose, he had been entertained by the governor, he'd been wined and dined, and he'd been there for many, many months. He was waiting for Captain Anthony. He had everything arranged. Breslin's name is also a great name in this enterprise, along with John Devoy, the planner, Captain Anthony, the captain of the rescue vessel, and Breslin. Well, to make a long story short, arrangements were such that Captain Anthony was to go in by night and wait at an appointed place on the beach. He did, but what was he to do with his ship in the meantime? Up to this time, he was the only person on board the ship who knew what was going on. He took his first mate into his confidence, and of course the crew was wondering, I mean, there were no whales up on the beach. So he took the first mate into his confidence, and fortunately the first mate agreed completely that this was a noble enterprise, the rescue of prisoners who had fought for their freedom and so on, and America was to be their political haven. He went in then, Captain Anthony, and he waited all night. The next day, Breslin drove up with the prisoners. He had managed to get them away from their guards, brought them up here, and unfortunately, hot on his heels was coming a police chase. But the prisoners were got into their vessel, and in the meantime, they were saying goodbye to this town of Fremantle in Australia. The town in which they had been imprisoned in this particular building, and from which now they were escaping, but via a race with the police authorities. So the crew pulled on their oars and sailed out onto the ocean, trying to arrive at the Catalpa's side before a police cutter, which is barely visible here in the extreme left of your screen. That sail is a police cutter coming down upon them. It was one of these nip and tuck things, but they got aboard and our heroes are safe. It was so close, however, that they the prisoners recognized the personnel in the police cutter and waved to them, called them by their names, and shouted a goodbye. The police cutter noticed that the rails of the whaler were lined with men, the crew, who had rifles, and the police cutter had only small arms, so wisely did nothing at this particular moment. However, as quickly as they could, they reported this to a gunboat called the Georgette, and the Georgette took after the Catalpa. The Georgette was twice the size and a faster vessel. It was 400 tons. It was a faster vessel. It caught up with the Georgette, fired a warning shot across its bow, and asked that they stop in the name of Her Majesty and deliver up the prisoners. Captain Anthony pointed to the American flag very dramatically and warned him not to fire upon the American flag. Meantime, there was a small group of soldiers, something like National Guard, hastily recruited from the town, a small guard of soldiers on the upper deck of the Georgette, and they were ordered to keep their guns at the ready, and the two vessels were as close could be for the sake of safety, while they continued their, shall we say, discussion. But Captain Anthony was adamant. He refused to give up his prisoners. He claimed he was taking them to political asylum. The Georgette followed for almost a day and then fell back. And Captain Anthony knew then that he was homeward bound, fighting as best he could the gales of the sea and the difficulties in general attendant upon his voyage. But that wasn't the only difficulty. English warships awaited him at St. Helena, and at other places an interception was attempted. But eventually he returned safely to America, to the astonishment of a pilot in the New York harbor. A whaling vessel sends word saying, "We should like to be conducted into the harbor and to a safe pier." A whaler in New York harbor. But the men arrived in New York, and they were feted. The prisoners made news all over the country, and indeed, they were presented in most dramatic terms as having come to the home of the free, the American flag, their protector. They generated such enthusiasm all over the country that when Captain Anthony returned to his own native New Bedford with his vessel, he was given a 70-gun salute. And now, what was Captain Anthony to do? He had begun this voyage because he had been tired of being a landlubber, and the excitement of going to sea, and the added excitement of freeing political prisoners seemed to him something that was well worth doing. He had gone as a man recently married, in the top condition of health, weight about 160 pounds. He returned quite a bit gray and weighing only 123 pounds, and a man who could never go to sea again, because every British port was closed to him. Well, Captain Anthony got a job on the police force and was at the desk in the police house, in the police station in New Bedford one day when a letter came from Australia with a description of the escaped prisoners asking for police help in locating them. We can imagine how Captain Anthony must have chuckled over that. He was then given a job in President Cleveland's first term in the Customs House, and thus ended the career of Captain George S. Anthony. But this was one of the extraordinary situations, but not the only one, in which America and England were somewhat involved in violent disputes because of Ireland. And England was beginning to realize in the 19th century that having got rid of the Irish, perhaps, was not really the end of her peace, because in America now they were able to mount successful efforts to help restore Irish independence.
If you would like a list of selected readings to add to your enjoyment, please send a self-addressed stamped envelope to Professor John McKiernan, College of St. Thomas, St. Paul, Minnesota. This program has been presented as a public service by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation and produced at KTCA-TV, Minneapolis, St. Paul.